dirty athlete and a crusader for clean sport. It was an unlikely combination.
Second in the Russian Championships. As I said, she had a fright before she did indeed qualify for this final.
We have reversed there the presumption of innocence for the Russian athletes.
The decision is designed to punish the guilty parties and send the message that it will not be tolerated. It stands strong against those who cheated the system.
World Anti-Doping Agency suspended Russia's sports drug testing lab.
So today's book review is certainly not the most educational book I've done, but it's certainly one of the more entertaining ones. It's got it all. It's got a love story, a doping scandal, and then the story of an athlete. So today's book is actually by David Walsh again. So he's an Irish author or journalist or investigative journalist. So he actually did last week's book, Seven Deadly Sins, the Lance Armstrong book that Dara did. So today's book is The Russian Affair, the true story of the couple who uncovered the greatest sporting scandal. So this book is written by David Walsh. So it follows the story of Vitaly Stepanov and Yulia Rozanov. So Yulia is an 800-meter runner for Russia. So late 2000s kind of, our story kind of peaks around then. So basically what it follows is her husband or husband-to-be works for Rusada, and it goes through the story how they ended up exposing the Russian doping scandal to a German documentary. A lot of you might remember that German documentary coming out, and it is such a good story. So there's three kind of big things that this story has. So the first one is the reason I kind of bought this book or went to listen to it, and it is the doping scandal. So Yulia is an 800-meter runner. She takes you through her story of being an athlete in kind of Russia and the whole system around doping and how it happens, how it started for her, some of the process they went through, how she was passing drug tests, the corruption involved, and then it really kind of brings, it's very well written and the story is so compelling. David Walsh is a phenomenal journalist and author as well, so he really makes the nitty-gritty details of this compelling and something you really want to listen to and find out more about. So that's obviously the first reason I clicked on it. So a lot of you involved or listening to this channel are certainly familiar with the Olympics and the doping scandal surrounding that, and a lot of you are weightlifters and you're involved in the doping scandal. So this is another kind of piece of the pie, and it's something that really adds to the kind of culture of doping or the kind of the story around doping. So it's so interesting and it really gives you some hard facts. It's very, very interesting. They go into some very nitty-gritty details of the doping, so what she was taking, how much she was taking. A lot of times these things, they kind of gloss over them, but it's very, very detailed while not coming bogged down with the details. So it's kind of it's a nice balance, and it's a credit to David Walsh and his ability to kind of parlay that with the rest of the story. So it really gives you a deep dive into what state-sponsored doping looks like from an athlete's perspective. So the second part of this book that's incredibly compelling and very, very entertaining to listen to is it just has the story of an athlete. So I'm not a huge sports autobiography fan or biography fan. I'm not really, it's very rare that I'll read one that I particularly enjoy or like The White Prisoner, Galopin Bavesky's biography, he didn't write it himself, I suppose, is not particularly compelling. I didn't finish that book. I was I was kind of tripe, to be honest. So last week or the week before I did the training of a weightlifter, and that kind of autobiography of his training was incredibly very entertaining. It's a great story and I really loved it, but for the most part most autobiographies are not something I have any interest in. But this is not so much how I became to greatness, from Yulia's perspective, but rather it's a really nitty-gritty story of being an athlete and what really it is like being an athlete in a state-sponsored program, coming from the other side, I suppose, of what it looks like from inside the kind of trenches of state-sponsored athletes, and what goes into being that athlete, the trials of trying to make the team, just because you're the best doesn't mean you'll be selected. A lot of it touches in as well on dealing with drugs. Other athletes had access to better drugs. Athletes had better systems with their drugs. Their coaches had more power and corruption and kind of sway over political kind of pull. And then it really hones in on the kind of even the unfairness among not only from the people taking drugs and not taking drugs, but the people taking drugs and people who can take better drugs for longer. So I really like the kind of trials and tribulations of an athlete. I always feel it's very entertaining because it's a very kind of real experience when you're listening to it. Finally, the last aspect of the book, kind of the big tree of things that are very very compelling about this book is the actual love story of the book. So between Yulia and Vitaly. So I suppose it's kind of an unlikely love story, and I'm not particularly one who is usually that interested in love story books, but it's a very human, it's a very real kind of love story. It's very, very kind of dark in some points of it, and it's very unlikely because Vitaly works for USADA, or works for a certain point, and Yulia is obviously a doped athlete, so you would think the relationship wouldn't work, but it's very well written, it's very compelling, and you'll be kind of invested in the love story given all the other aspects going around it. So it's not often I thought I'd be saying this, and I don't think I'd be saying this on the book review for kind of a sports performance channel, but it is definitely a part of the book that is very entertaining, and it's not to be left out. Finally, on the kind of commentary around the book, I think what you'll find very interesting about this, or what will be very noteworthy to you, is just how, you know, how lackadaisical Wada wrote out this. So you'll see throughout the book, it's not really a spoiler, but Vitaly's obviously working for USADA, and he's against doping, which is not common in Russian anti-doping circles by the looks of things. So Vitaly contacts Wada multiple times, gives him very specific information, even on his wife, and Wada are completely inactive. They're very lackadaisical. They pay very little attention to us. There's no hard action until you get to the end where the Germans expose via documentary. And then Wada knew this was coming up. Around this time also, Icarus was coming out. I feel like Icarus got a lot more of the credit. I was aware of this when this came out. I remember I think it was ARD, the documentary came out on. I didn't actually watch it, but it came out around the same time as Icarus.
There never was anti-doping in Russia, ever.
So maybe a little bit further before that, Rodchenkov's name pops up a few times in the book, and it touches on a lot of the same subjects and some of the people who were heart attacked. So very, very compelling story. Funny in this book, they're trying to take the credit for exposing the scandal, but I feel like Icarus opened a lot of people's eyes and had a lot more sway, that kind of hard factor, than, you know, this. But this is incredible. It was very, very interesting. But I think that big thing about WADA being, you know, just as corrupt as anyone else, I think if you can see it from that point of view, you can see, you know, that until their hand was forced, they made no attempt to really clean up the affairs. At the end of this book, actually, so there was another, David Walsh had actually been in contact with one of the guys who was heart attacked, as Rodchenkov put it. So they were talking about writing another book, and they reckon that's probably what happened to him. So it's very, very interesting, and I would love to have seen that book if David had actually ended up being able to do that. But I suppose that's how the cookie crumbles. Very, very interesting book. It's got a lot going for it. It's very, very compelling. It's not too long, and you listen to it pretty quickly, because if you're interested in sports and sports performance and, you know, all the kind of aspects that come of that, I think you'll find this a very interesting book. I know I did. I mean, I'm not someone who is morally for or against doping, but I find this whole thing incredibly compelling. It's such an interesting story. I listened to this on Audible. I don't know how we would fare out. The reader, the narrator for Audible is quite good, so it's not an issue that way. The audiobook is good quality, which I mentioned a few times isn't something that always happens, but I can safely say I would definitely recommend this book to any of you guys, because I think you will really enjoy it.